Hi, I'm KB Howard, the author of The Boy from Yesterday. In this episode, I'd like to offer you an epilogue or a postscript to the podcast episodes that contain the entire text of the book of the story of The Boy from Yesterday. Give you a little bit of an update. So, today is the day of this recording, which is December 31st of 2020. And it's been a hard year for a lot of people all across the world because we've been dealing with the COVID-19 or novel coronavirus pandemic. I use a software that keeps statistics on the broadcast of the podcast, and it gives me a lot of good information about how many people have listened to each episode, how many people in each country or in the United States, in which state, and I've been very pleased and happy that The Boy from Yesterday's story, in the form of its podcast version, has reached so many people in so many countries around the world. So thank you for listening. I have noticed that not every episode has the same number of listeners. I always assumed before I did it that people would be listening to every episode, but some episodes or chapters of the book have had more downloads than others. I don't know how that works. Anyway, if you're just hearing this episode, the epilogue, the postscript to the story, I really do encourage you to go back to chapter 1 or episode 1 and listen to the story straight through when you have time. Do it while being in your car or doing other things, because I would really love to share the story with you. So, as you know, because you've heard all the episodes, The Boy from Yesterday is really a book. It's a book that was turned into a podcast for these purposes, but it really is still a bit of a work in progress. I'm still looking for a literary agent, and once I have a literary agent, we're hoping to get The Boy from Yesterday published by a mainstream publisher, and maybe even ambitions beyond that, maybe even into a feature film or a made-for-television movie. So, in those statistics, I notice that there have been no downloads of the show or of the story in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire of 1890 and of the present day is where the story takes place. I find that a little ironic. So if you know anybody in New Hampshire, particularly in the city that Chesterfield is based on, Keene, New Hampshire. That's let you in on a little secret to the most loyal listeners. That's where the fictional Chesterfield is. There is a Chesterfield, New Hampshire. It's a smaller town to the west of Keene, but Keene is really where I had in mind when I wrote the story. So if you know anybody in New Hampshire, tell them to give it a listen, because it's about their city, and it's about their state. It's ironic that The Boy from Yesterday's story is about a time traveler coming from 1890 to the present day in search of medicine to help a sick friend, to try to get the medicine, take back through time, back to his time, and to save his friend. Does he? Well, you'll have to listen and see. That's the story. But when I first started writing the book in about 2013, with some early research, part of what I was thinking was, one of the themes of the book, was that we should all be so grateful of the wonders of our frontline health workers, particularly doctors, physicians, but also frontline workers who are nurses, pharmacists, and especially pharmaceutical researchers who devise and create the drugs that we have now, particularly in the case of the story antibiotics. As I said in the prologue episode that tells you some about the story, I really wrote this as an allegory to the AIDS crisis. I'm very open about living with HIV and AIDS myself for 30 years this year in 2020, and the advent of the protease inhibitor class of drug in 1995 really helped to drastically reduce, almost eliminate, not quite, but almost, the number of deaths from AIDS worldwide. Medical technology had come to the point where the greatest devastation of the AIDS crisis was certainly very, very slowed, and of course stabilizes people like me living with the virus into living very healthy, very productive, very full lives. So the story was about an appreciation of medicine that basically said, let's appreciate in the present day that there are treatments or cures for diseases today that would have killed our ancestors. And so we're grateful for the technology that helps our loved ones of all kinds to be with us and not to succumb. Now, of course, the fact that the podcast became more popular and even was recorded some in 2020 with the COVID-19 or coronavirus is ironic, because the story is supposed to be about how progressive the present day is and how much progress we've made, and how we're celebrating medical technology that, today's medical technology would have helped to improve or even cure Sam in the story very quickly with antibiotics. But with COVID-19, we've been humbled all over again that despite our best medical technology, the COVID-19 virus has killed many people worldwide, and at this date, over 300,000 in the United States of America alone. So we've been very humbled by that, we've been very saddened by that, and yet, once again, medical technology gives us hope with the development of not one, but several vaccines by very, very dedicated scientists, and lots of money and lots of effort and lots of hope put into those technologies. And we're pretty sure, as a global community, that these vaccines will protect against COVID-19, hopefully very, very soon, to prevent more deaths. So we have to pretend a little bit that if we read The Boy from Yesterday or listen to it, that Tom's time traveling to a future where medical technology is very advanced. He couldn't really come to 2020 exactly, because it would have been a very different story, even though it takes place in kind of a fictional 2020 where coronavirus doesn't exist. Or maybe we can say, Tom comes to 2019, let's say. But it's really about the present day, and it's just a little irony about the stories. I'm wondering if some of you listeners have noticed that irony as well as you hear the story. I also think thematically with the story, we look at themes. So in COVID-19, just like in the AIDS crisis, I think it brought out the best of us and it brought out the worst of us. During the AIDS crisis, you saw all kinds of violence from people that were deathly afraid, irrationally afraid of HIV and AIDS, and would act out violently against people who either had it or could potentially have it, particularly in the gay community. And COVID-19 has brought out the worst in us. It's brought out denial of science. It's brought out selfishness. It's brought out mockery, saying that the virus is a hoax, and yet some of the same people who said it was a hoax were the first ones in line as well-to-do politicians to get their dose of the vaccine. Isn't that ironic? But then also, we've seen a lot of self-sacrifice. People who want to travel to see their families, but they can't. They stay home in order to avoid the risk of contagion and spreading it socially. And other sacrifices. We've had so many jobs lost. We've had income lost. We've had so many opportunities lost, especially for anything that requires public contact. Restaurants, theaters, musicians, sports arenas, all kinds of things where groups congregate. And yet one of the themes of the story is that some people will do anything to help a friend. If you've read the story, or if you've heard the story in the podcast, then you know that there are many examples of the themes of how people will do anything to help a friend and act out of selflessness and out of love for their friend in order to help their friend as best they can. I noticed also, before or as I wrote The Boy from Yesterday, I was not aware of Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series of novels of romantic fantasy, or the highly acclaimed television adaptation. I started watching the series, like a lot of people, on Netflix, with some free time on my hands, staying at home and trying to be safe. And, without knowing the Outlander story, when I wrote Boy from Yesterday, I noticed parallels sometimes. And, parallels and similarities in creative works are a very awkward thing because, there's things like copyright laws. And so, as they say sometimes in disclaimers, any relationship between the works is purely coincidental about time travel stories. But if you look at some of the themes in the Outlander series, one of them, I think, is the idea that love is timeless. Another idea that was in an episode of Outlander I saw not too long ago was about Brianna, saying, in a sense, you can't trust history without being there yourself, that history is really formed by the people who are writing about it, and that can be different from how it actually was. I certainly noticed that about the AIDS crisis. I was working in social services during the height of the AIDS crisis, and there's a lot of things that people talk about it today, some 25, 30 years later or so, that things were different than what history says. So I think that's a theme. In Outlander, we also see people making tough choices, doing what your heart says to do versus what people expect, and realizing that in the history of our world, there are not really better or worse time periods, except that, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of history bends toward justice. That it's long, but it bends toward justice. And it is true. In Outlander, women like Claire would not have had women's rights, for example, in the 18th century. The types of criminal justice punishment, of course, would have been much more cruel and corporal and capital, as we know. So there are aspects of the past that to our modern sensibilities seem barbaric, particularly toward civil rights for so many people, for women, for the LGBT community, for people of color. But also the positive sides are that, our world was less polluted, and many species that are now extinct were flourishing. And there were a lot of good things about the past, too. And that theme is also present in The Boy from Yesterday, about Tom's world of 1890 versus Laurel's world in the 21st century. Another theme in the book is looking at where there is animus, where there is conflict. There's a theme of Tom versus Sam's illness, so he's fighting against nature. Laurel and Christian have a conflict in the dying relationship. Gloria and Christian, Christian's mother. There's a battle between Christian and the whole concept of defeat, someone who just will not be bettered by anyone else for any reason. He can't stand it psychologically. A little bit of a conflict there between Tom and Dr. Hurd, the frustration and the panic that Tom has that Dr. Hurd can't really help Sam. And for fun, a conflict between Marguerite, Laurel's grandmother, and Agnes Murphy, the librarian. We also look at not just animus and conflict, but another theme is about the many faces of love. There's Tom and Sam. Tom and Sam are really not gay characters, but they share a bromance. They share a fraternal love, and that's a certain special kind of love between two men. You can even have that fraternal bromance between one gay guy and one straight guy, or even two gay friends. But certainly one of the major love stories of the whole book, or of the whole story and podcast, is between Tom and Sam, the love of friends. There's certainly a paternal type of love between Zeller the magician and Tom. He lovingly gives the ring to Tom, knowing that it would help him. There's certainly love between Tom and Laurel, right? That's the primary romance of the story. There can be girlfriend love between Emily and Laurel as best girlfriends. There's certainly a love between a grandmother and a granddaughter, between Marguerite and Laurel. There is a gay love between TJ and Peter. There's kind of a budding romance between Trixie, the waitress at the Rocket Diner, and Jimmy, TJ's brother. And certainly a love among older people, grandparents' age, between Marguerite and Clark. I'm reminded at this time, those of you who are fans of Downton Abbey, if you're not familiar with it, this won't make sense, but, and I'm going to ruin a little bit of an end of the series end for you before the movies, just in one line, so little tiny bit of a spoiler. But in Downton Abbey, one of the most beloved characters is played by Maggie Smith as Violet, the Dowager Countess of Grantham. And in the Christmas special, the last episode of season 6 of the series, Violet says to Isabel, takes place on New Year's Eve, something along the lines of, I'm going to botch the line because I haven't heard it enough to memorize it. But Isabel says to Violet, isn't it interesting how with the stroke of 12 of every New Year's Eve, we celebrate a whole new year, and time moves in one direction, ever forward. And Violet says, after a moment of reflection, yes, if only we had the choice. You see, to Violet, I think, would be just as happy for time to go backward at a certain point than it would to go forward. Because Violet kind of had a preference for the way things were done in the old days, in her day, in her heyday. And a lot of the theme of Downton Abbey is about how things were versus how they became from, say, the 1910s or teens in the first episode up through the 20s for the last seasons and the follow-up feature films. And we think about that. Time moves in one direction forward. We celebrate the new year, but also with the knowledge that for better or for worse, maybe in the case of 2020 for better, we put the old year behind us, and whatever it was, good or bad, it is gone. It is gone and lost to time. So, in this New Year's, we have the good and the bad in 2020. We had so many things that people complained about in 2020, and so many things that were the source of heartache. There was political unrest, particularly in the United States, but also with the Brexit controversy and things in the Middle East and things in Europe, really the world over. And I'm happy to say The Boy from Yesterday reaches the world over. So maybe in your corner of the world, if you're hearing this, think about what's been good about 2020 that you really appreciate. Maybe something good happened for you personally. But also think about the things that, you could have done without. Certainly the unrest and any kind of hardship specific to you or to your family. But also hardship that the world endured because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, just wanted to share those thoughts with you and give you a little bit of a follow-up as like I said, a postscript to the story. In terms of future plans, currently, the text of the story of The Boy from Yesterday is being edited by a friend and a close colleague who is serving as the editor for the book before we continue to submit it to literary agents. If you are a literary agent and you like this story, please get in touch with me because I would like to have a literary agent. I want to share the story in the book form with many people. And I also have been just starting to do more talks. I am a social worker. I'm a clinical social worker and psychotherapist and life, relationship, and business coach by trade. I'm not really a full-time author, so that's another little secret for you loyal listeners, but I am giving some talks and interviews occasionally where I mention the story, to promote the story. And so if you're interested in that, you may get in touch. And we'll also be looking at, could this story have some feature film or TV potential? Because I think it could. Outlander really corners the market on time travel stories, but I think there's a place for some younger characters and a place for a different kind of story. So, I'm KB Howard, and if you'd like to get in touch, my best email address, I'm an MSW, a Master of Social Work, and my email address is kbhmsw@aol.com. I know, that's an old-fashioned domain, but I've had it a long time, and I'd rather spend my time writing and creating and working rather than changing over my email address, so I just keep putting it off. So kbhmsw@aol.com is the email address if you'd like to reach me for any reason. If you have a question, if you have a suggestion, if you have a complaint, that's okay too. And for those of you who have listened to the story, thank you. You really honor me with listening to the story. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if somehow you haven't heard the story, I encourage you to give it a listen. And I hope that you'll enjoy hearing it and eventually reading it as much as I have in creating it. So, with that said, Happy New Year.